The soft murmur of conversation and the clinking of fine china filled the air at La Fontaine, a high-end restaurant in Raleigh, North Carolina. The scent of truffle oil and freshly baked bread mingled with the faint notes of a classical piano recording, playing through hidden speakers. Deborah moved between the tables, her steps swift yet graceful. At 25, she had perfected the art of being invisible, a waitress who appeared only when needed and melted into the background when she wasn't. Her uniform was crisp, her hair tied neatly back, and her smile polite but distant. Few patrons looked closely enough to notice her hands, long, slender fingers that carried plates and poured wine with ease, but hands that told another story. Calloused fingertips betrayed hours spent pressing piano keys. Small scars whispered of years of work in kitchens and warehouses, jobs taken to survive rather than thrive. Hands that had once dreamed of something greater, but now bore the weight of reality. Deborah's dreams had been born in a modest home in rural South Carolina. Her mother, a nurse who worked tirelessly to keep the family afloat, had scraped together enough to buy a second-hand piano from a neighbor. The instrument had been old, its keys yellowed, and its sound slightly off-tune, but to Deborah, it was magic. She spent countless hours teaching herself to play, her small fingers stumbling over notes, then gliding through melodies as she grew older. The piano became her sanctuary, a place where she could lose herself and imagine a world beyond their tiny house and the endless struggle to make ends meet. But dreams, Deborah learned early, didn't pay the bills. When she turned 18, her mother's health began to decline, and Deborah set aside her aspirations to take on multiple jobs. The dream of becoming a concert pianist was boxed up, stored in the back of her mind, and labeled someday. That Friday night at La Fontaine was supposed to be like any other. Deborah had memorized the menu, knew which tables needed extra attention, and had mastered the rhythm of the busy dining room. But when he walked in, the air seemed to shift. Leonard swept through the entrance as if the world existed solely for his amusement. He was tall, with a designer suit tailored to perfection, and his presence was impossible to ignore. Flanked by a group of equally polished companions, he exuded the kind of confidence that only came with immense wealth and privilege. Deborah felt his gaze on her almost immediately, lingering just a beat too long, like a predator sizing up its prey. By the time she approached his table to take their order, his smirk had already settled into place. "Deborah," he said, glancing at her name tag, his voice smooth but edged with condescension. A name that carries a lot of promise. Hidden talents, maybe. Deborah's smile didn't waver, though she felt a flicker of irritation. "Just here to serve tonight, sir," she replied, setting the wine menu down with practiced precision. Leonard chuckled, leaning back in his chair. His companions laughed along, their eyes flicking toward Deborah like she was part of the evening's entertainment. Throughout the meal, Leonard's remarks grew bolder, each one louder than the last, drawing attention from nearby tables. Deborah kept her composure, her movements steady and professional, but inside, her frustration simmered. The turning point came when Leonard leaned back after dessert, swirling his wine and eyeing Deborah with a mix of amusement and challenge. "Tell me, Deborah," he drawled, "what's your real dream? Don't tell me waiting tables, is it?" Deborah hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "I play piano," she said softly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Leonard's eyes lit up with interest, though not the kind she hoped for. "A pianist? How delightful! Well, there's your stage right there." He gestured grandly toward the grand piano in the corner of the restaurant, its glossy surface catching the dim light. "Why don't you give us a performance?" Deborah's heart sank. "I can't," she said quickly. "I'm working." "Nonsense," Leonard insisted, his voice loud enough to draw more attention. "What's a little performance? Unless, of course, you're all talk." The challenge hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Deborah's hands clenched into fists at her sides. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "Never let anyone make you small. You're bigger than their words." "Fine," she said, her voice steady but laced with determination. "I'll play." A hush fell over the room as Deborah made her way to the piano. Her steps felt heavy, as if the weight of every doubt and sacrifice she'd ever carried was pressing down on her. She sat down, her fingers hovering over the keys. For a moment she hesitated, the enormity of the moment threatening to overwhelm her. Then she began to play. The first notes were soft, tentative, like a whisper in a crowded room. But as the melody unfolded, her confidence grew. She chose Clair de Lune, a piece she'd learned as a teenager, its haunting beauty etched into her soul. The music poured out of her, weaving through the room like a spell. Each note was a story, of a girl who dreamed of concert halls, of a mother's sacrifices, of resilience forged in the fires of hardship. The dining room fell silent. Conversations stopped, forks hovered in midair, and every eye was on her. Even Leonard, who had leaned back in smug amusement, now sat upright, his smirk replaced by something unreadable. Deborah's hands moved with a grace and precision that belied the years she'd spent away from the piano. The music was her voice, raw and unfiltered, and it demanded to be heard. When the final note faded, the silence lingered, heavy and electric. Then, as if on cue, applause erupted. It was thunderous, filling the room with a warmth that Deborah hadn't felt in years. Some stood, clapping with tears in their eyes. Others leaned forward, as if trying to hold on to the moment a little longer. Deborah rose from the piano, her chest heaving, her hands trembling. She turned to face the room, her gaze landing on Leonard. He clapped, but the arrogance in his expression had melted into something quieter. Humility, perhaps, or shame. "You have a gift," he said, his voice subdued. Deborah held his gaze, her own steady and unyielding. "Everyone does," she replied. "It's how you use it that matters." Leonard said nothing more. His companions looked away, their earlier laughter replaced by uncomfortable silence. That night, as Deborah walked home under the glow of streetlights, her steps felt lighter. She wasn't thinking of Leonard or the applause. She was thinking of the music, of the way it had felt to reclaim a part of herself she thought she'd lost. For the first time in years, she believed in her own voice again. A week later, a phone call changed everything. A producer from Nashville had been dining at La Fontaine that night. He wasn't promising fame, only the chance to record a demo, but for Deborah, it was more than enough. It wasn't the dream, but it was the first step. That evening, she sat at her small apartment, her fingers gliding over the keys of her old piano. The sound wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. It was hers, and as the music filled the room, she knew her journey was just beginning.